The county's notice arrived before Clara Whitmore had finished watering the roses. By Friday morning, bright orange stakes surrounded the oldest corner of her garden. If the complaint was upheld, that entire section would be removed before the following week. Most people assumed it was another disagreement over property lines. Clara couldn't explain why, but the moment she read the notice, she looked toward the same patch of ground her father had always protected. For 22 years, the garden had been more than a place to grow vegetables. After her husband died, it became the one routine that never changed. Every sunrise began the same way. She would walk each narrow path, straighten a leaning stake, pull a single weed, and quietly leave a smooth river stone beside whichever plant had produced its first fruit that morning. It was a habit no one understood. One corner, however, was different. A rough circle of old limestone blocks rested beneath climbing beans, exactly where her father had left them decades earlier. He had never allowed anyone to move those stones. Whenever Clara asked why, he always smiled and answered the same way. Some things aren't ours to disturb. He never said another word. The first inspector measured fences, checked old maps, and photographed flower beds without finding anything unusual. Then Clara noticed someone she had never seen before. He wasn't carrying a clipboard. He wasn't asking questions. He simply stood beside the county truck, watching the limestone border as though nothing else in the garden existed. When one inspector casually suggested the stones might have to be lifted to finish the survey, the man instinctively took one step forward before stopping himself. For just a heartbeat, his face revealed something impossible to hide. It wasn't curiosity, it was fear. The survey team returned 2 mornings later. This time, an older county surveyor climbed out of the truck carrying a weathered leather tube filled with decades-old land records. Instead of checking the fence lines first, he walked straight to the limestone circle and crouched beside it. He ran his fingers lightly across one of the stones. Then he smiled to himself. "These weren't gathered from a field," he said quietly. "Someone placed every one of them here." Clara frowned. She had spent half her life looking at those stones. She had never once wondered who arranged them. The surveyor unrolled an original county map across the hood of his truck. After comparing measurements for several minutes, he looked back toward the circle. "The property lines make sense," he murmured, "but this feature doesn't. Not because it was missing, because everything around it had changed, while the stones had remained exactly where they were." As the inspection continued, Clara noticed movement from the corner of her eye. The unfamiliar man had quietly stepped away from the crowd. He pulled out his phone, not to make a call, to photograph the limestone circle from several different angles. The moment he noticed Clara watching him, he lowered the phone and slipped it back into his pocket as though nothing had happened. A few minutes later, one of the younger workers reached for a loose stone, intending to move it aside for a measurement. Before anyone else could react, the stranger crossed the yard. "Don't!" The single word came too quickly, too urgently. The entire garden fell silent. Realizing every eye was now on him, the man forced an uneasy smile. "I just thought you should photograph everything first." The surveyor looked at him for a long moment, then slowly turned back toward the stone circle. For the first time, he no longer seemed to believe this was just another county inspection. The county trucks didn't return the next morning, neither did the surveyor. For the first time since the complaints began, Clara found herself alone with the limestone circle. She knelt beside the weathered stones, running her fingers through the damp soil the way she had done every spring for years. Something felt different. Near the edge of one stone, the earth looked freshly disturbed. Not dug, just pressed down, as though someone had stood there recently. She brushed away a thin layer of loose dirt. A faint boot print emerged. It wasn't hers. It wasn't from the county workers either. Their heavy work boots had left deep tread marks across the garden. This print was smaller, almost smooth, like the sole of a hiking boot. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her phone and took several photographs before the morning sun erased the impression. An hour later, the surveyor arrived. She showed him the pictures. He studied them for only a moment before looking toward the road. "So someone came back after we left." Before Clara could answer, the sound of an engine echoed across the property. The unfamiliar man's truck slowed as it passed the garden. He didn't stop, but he looked directly toward the limestone circle, then toward Clara, then drove away. The surveyor watched until the truck disappeared around the bend. "He isn't checking on the complaint anymore," he said quietly. "He's checking on the stones." That afternoon, the surveyor requested an overnight patrol around the property. Not because anyone had found evidence beneath the limestone, because someone appeared far more interested in reaching it before the county did. The county extended the removal order by another 48 hours. Officially, it was to review the survey, Unofficially, the surveyor admitted something no one else would. "I don't like the idea of leaving those stones unguarded." That evening, his question stayed with Clara. "Has anything around them ever disappeared?" Her first instinct was to say no. Then, almost unexpectedly, a childhood memory surfaced. "There used to be an iron post beside the circle," she said quietly. "I haven't thought about it in years." After the surveyor left, Clara walked to the old garden shed her father had always kept locked. She hesitated before lifting the stiff brass latch. No one had opened that cabinet since the week he passed away. Inside were exactly what she expected. Seed packets, rainfall logs, fertilizer receipts, garden sketches. One notebook after another recorded ordinary seasons lived by ordinary days. Nothing explained the stones. After nearly half an hour, Clara sighed and began returning everything to the cabinet. As she slid the final notebook onto the shelf, something underneath shifted. A much thinner journal, wedged beneath the wooden base, slipped forward just enough for its worn leather corner to catch the light. She froze. The pages contained almost nothing, only a rough sketch of the limestone circle. And beside it, written in her father's careful handwriting, a single sentence. "If the marker is ever missing, don't move the stones." No explanation, no date, no signature. Clara drove straight to the surveyor's office before sunrise. He read the sentence twice, then quietly closed the journal. "We've been asking the wrong question." He looked toward the garden through the office window. "Someone didn't remove the marker to hide where this place was." He paused. "They removed it to make sure no one ever knew what it marked." The surveyor returned just after sunrise with someone Clara hadn't met before. A county historian stepped out of the second truck, carrying a canvas field bag, a measuring rod, and a weathered notebook filled with sketches from old excavation sites. She didn't walk straight to the limestone circle. Instead, she slowly circled it once, then again. On the third pass, she crouched low, letting the early morning sunlight fall across the grass instead of looking directly at the stones. Almost 5 minutes passed without anyone speaking. Finally, she pressed the measuring rod into the ground a few feet beyond the circle. She frowned, then moved several yards farther and repeated the test. Only then did she look at the surveyor. "Come here!" A faint strip of grass stretched away from the stones in an almost perfectly straight line. It wasn't obvious. The color changed only slightly, and only from that angle beneath the morning light. Clara stared at it. She had mowed this yard for more than 20 years. She had never noticed it. The historian smiled softly. Most people wouldn't. She explained that buried stone foundations often change the way moisture moved through the soil. Long after the structures disappeared, the ground sometimes remembered where they had been. The surveyor followed the faint line until it ended beneath an old maple tree near the edge of the property. Before he could say a word, tires crunched across the gravel road. The unfamiliar man climbed out of his truck almost before it stopped moving. His eyes locked onto the maple tree. For the first time, he made no attempt to hide his fear. "Please," he said, his voice barely steady. "Don't dig there." No one moved, because everyone suddenly realized the limestone circle had never been the destination. It had been pointing towards something else all along. The excavation began just after sunrise. Before anyone touched the ground, the surveyor checked his watch. "If we can't justify this excavation by sunset," he said quietly, "the county removes the garden tomorrow morning." No one needed reminding what was at stake. Only hand tools were allowed. Nearly an hour passed before the historian suddenly raised her hand. "Stop!" She knelt beside the shallow trench and carefully brushed away the loose soil. A flat stone slowly emerged. Unlike the rough limestone circle, this slab had been shaped by hand. Thin carved lines crossed its surface in a pattern that was clearly intentional. The surveyor leaned closer. "These aren't decorative." He stopped. His eyes remained fixed on the carvings as though he was trying to understand something that refused to make sense. Before he could say another word, Clara heard footsteps behind her. The stranger had stepped forward. His hands trembled. "I never wanted this day to come," he said quietly. No one answered. He swallowed hard before continuing. "My grandfather made me promise never to show anyone what he taught me." For several seconds, he simply stared at the stone. "When I was a boy, he made me copy those markings over and over." Silence settled across the garden. The surveyor looked up. "What did you just say?" The stranger hesitated once more. Then, with obvious reluctance, he reached inside his jacket and unfolded a brittle sheet of paper that had been folded so many times the edges were beginning to tear. The historian leaned closer. The surveyor carefully took the page. He looked from the paper to the stone, then back again. Even the spacing of the carved lines matched. He lowered the page without speaking. Only after a long silence did he finally say, "If your grandfather copied this correctly," he looked toward the untouched strip of ground beyond the maple tree, "we've been digging in the wrong place." No one moved, because tomorrow morning, The county would either destroy the last untouched piece of Clara's garden or uncover the one place someone had spent generations trying to keep forgotten. The surveyor didn't waste another minute. Using the stranger's worn sketch, he measured from the carved stone to the untouched strip of ground beyond the maple tree. Then he quietly placed a wooden marker into the soil. Here! No one spoke as the historian loosened the earth with a hand trowel. The county's deadline was only hours away. If this spot revealed nothing, Clara's garden would be gone by morning. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Nothing. Then, thunk. The trowel struck wood. The historian immediately set the tool aside. Brushes. Layer by layer, dark soil gave way to a small wooden chest. Time had darkened the timber almost black, yet a coating of hardened pine resin had preserved it remarkably well. The surveyor looked toward Clara. "This should be your decision." She took a slow breath, then nodded. The lid lifted with a soft crack. Inside rested a weathered leather journal. The historian carefully opened the brittle cover. Her eyes moved across the first page, then stopped. Her hand froze. Without saying a word, she slowly passed the journal to the surveyor. As he lifted it, something beneath caught the morning light. A small brass surveying compass. He turned it over carefully. The engraved name matched the one written inside the journal. The surveyor read the opening page once, then again. When he finally looked up, there was quiet disbelief in his face. "This isn't someone's personal notebook." He looked at Clara. "It's the original field journal from the first survey of Ash Creek." Silence settled across the garden. Clara slowly knelt beside the open chest and rested her hand on the same soil she had cared for year after year. The garden everyone had tried to erase hadn't been hiding treasure. It had been protecting the very first chapter of the town's history. For the first time since the county notice arrived, she understood why her father had never allowed those stones to be moved. The county's decision came the very next afternoon. After reviewing the journal and the recovered survey records, officials permanently withdrew the removal order. Clara's garden would remain exactly where it had always been. Within weeks, the excavation was carefully preserved, and the small patch of ground beneath the maple tree became a protected historical site. The unfamiliar stranger returned only once. Without saying much, he handed Clara the faded sketch his grandfather had kept for so many years. "I should have trusted that the truth would survive," he said quietly. Clara accepted the folded paper. Neither of them tried to explain the past. There was nothing left to prove. Life around the farmhouse slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. One cool autumn morning, Clara stepped into the garden before sunrise, just as she had every day for more than 20 years. She straightened a leaning stake, pulled a single weed, then walked toward the old limestone circle. For a long moment, she simply looked at the weathered stones. She could almost hear her father's voice again. "Some things aren't ours to disturb." This time, she finally understood. He hadn't been protecting a secret for himself. He had been protecting it for people he would never live to meet. Clara knelt beside the limestone circle and gently brushed a little loose soil back against its edge, just as she had done countless times without ever knowing why. The morning sun climbed over the garden. Nothing looked different. And yet, everything had changed, because the place everyone once believed should be erased had quietly been waiting all along to tell its story.